Well, hello and welcome to Sunday Morning with Hope Valley. My name is Sam. I'm the lead pastor here at Hope Valley House Churches. And today we are concluding our three-part series on the topic of gratitude. So far we have talked about how gratitude comes from valuing what you already have and how that kind of gratitude is characterized by joy. We talked about that in the last lesson. And now we're going to see how these naturally produce authentic generosity, right? So gratitude that is based in valuing what you already have, which then is characterized by joy, lasting joy in your life. These things together all produce an authentic generosity. And we're going to see how generosity measures against fairness by contrast. And so, first thing I want to talk about is fairness, right? We are really concerned with things being fair. It's a pretty common human thing, right? We want to make sure things are fair. Why is that, right? Well, part of it is because our natural desire for satisfaction, right, drives us to ensure that all exchanges are fair, right? I want to be satisfied. I want what I want. So if I'm giving something up, you better give me something back in return, right? That's of equal value or better, right? And so that's another thing. We're usually okay with things being unfair as long as they're unfair in our favor, right? But we definitely want at minimum a fair exchange when we pursue satisfaction. And the pursuit of satisfaction is a common human behavior, right, that we've talked about in the last couple lessons. And so this desire for satisfaction drives us to ensure that all things are fair, right? And the pursuit of happiness, which we talked about last week, drives us to make sure that we're treated fairly. It's pretty hard to be happy when you're being mean to me, right? So if I'm nice to you, you better be nice to me. Again, this is a statement of fairness, right? I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be positive. You better be happy and positive back. Otherwise, you're going to throw off my groove, right? Like beware the groove, right? If you guys know that reference. And so this pursuit of happiness also wants us to make sure that things are fair, that we're being treated fairly, because we don't want people to throw off our groove and throw off our mood, because happiness is a mood. Happiness comes and goes, and we have to protect it by making sure that people are treating us fairly. And so both of these things push us to pursue fairness, right? And the problem with that, of course, is that we live in a very unfair world. Other people's satisfaction and other people's happiness often conflicts with our own. So let me ask you, what exactly would be fair, right? Because if I'm pursuing my satisfaction and happiness, and you're pursuing your satisfaction and happiness, and both of us want things to be fair in order so we can both be satisfied and happy, but our desires conflict, then what is fair? Because what's going to be fair for me may be unfair for you. So is that fair, right? This whole system falls apart, you can see, right? Because we live in an unfair world. And there are often circumstances that are beyond anyone's control as well, no matter how hard we try to make things fair. So even if we overcome those other, barriers I just talked about, we could be doing everything right to make sure everything's fair for everybody, and then things outside of our control can tip the balances, and now they're not fair anymore. So we can probably feel that frustration of wanting things to be fair, but living in an unfair world, having what is fair for us conflict with what's fair for somebody else in their opinion. And it's a whole hot mess, right, that comes from desiring fairness. Our concern for fairness will actually often leave us very unhappy and unsatisfied. That's the irony there, right? Is that satisfaction, happiness, the desire for fairness actually create this pretty sad, inescapable loop, right? So to contrast this, right? So far we've talked on the positive end, right? Contentment builds gratitude, which brings joy. And today we're going to talk about how that overflows in generosity. But on the other track, right? Wanting to be satisfied instead of content and wanting happiness instead of joy brings out this desire for fairness, but things aren't fair. They never are fair. And so then we're not satisfied. We're not happy. And it's just this like death loop of despair, right? It's broken, it's sad, and I think we all know what it feels like to ride that ride. And so, by contrast to this idea of fairness, we see generosity. Generosity doesn't care about fairness. It actually breaks that loop. Generosity doesn't care about fairness. Let me give you an example. In Matthew chapter 20, verse 1 through 15, Jesus tells actually a really frustrating parable. I'm going to paraphrase it for you here. I'm not going to read the whole thing. In this parable, a landowner hired people to work his field for a denarius. A denarius was the amount of money for a standard day's wage. And throughout the day, he kept hiring more people, right? And so the people who had worked the whole day expected that others were going to be paid less since they had worked less hours. So he hired people at the beginning of the day. He said, hey, beginning of the day here, work the whole day, you get a denarius, it's a fair wage for a whole day's work. And then he kept on hiring people, and some people didn't work a full day. In fact, some people only worked 1 or 2 hours at the end of the day. So they, kind of logically assumed, oh, they're not going to get a denarius like we are, or maybe he's changed his mind, he's going to pay us more, right? At the end of the day, the landowner just pays everyone the same original wage. He gives everybody, regardless of how many hours they worked, he gives them all a full day's wage. And when the people who had worked the full day complained about this, this is what he replies in verse 13 of this parable. He says, friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Didn't you agree with me on a denarius? Take what is yours and go. I want to give this last man the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with what is mine? Are you jealous? Because I am generous. And the reason this parable is so frustrating is because generosity isn't fair. That part of you that hears that parable and you're like, I'm totally on the side of the people who work the full day. I don't like what the landowner's doing. That's the part of your heart that wants everything to be fair. Right? That parable stirs that up in us. And you might go, oh, I'd rather be generous than be fair. But when you hear that story and you kind of hate it because it's not right. Because why the guy who worked 2 hours get paid the same as the guy who worked 12? Right? And Jesus is using this parable to reveal a key aspect of God's character, his generosity. He blesses us out of his generosity and not according to what we deserve, which is really good news for us, by the way, because what we deserve from God is absolutely nothing. So if God was concerned about things being fair with me, I'd be dead already. Right? So his generosity is actually really, really good news, and we should all be very happy that we serve a generous God and not a fair God in that sense. Right? And we have to think about this. If we're going to be like Jesus, then we have to embrace generosity over fairness. And think about that loop I just talked about, right? The satisfaction, happiness, fairness loop, and just how horrible that ride is. One of the things that breaks that wheel apart is generosity. And Jesus is generous, and the Father is generous, and those who follow him must be generous, right? Now consider 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1 through 2. This is Paul writing to the church in Corinth, and he's encouraging them to put some money and resources together to take care of the needs of the believers in Jerusalem who are experiencing hard times and famine. And he says to them in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1, we want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches of Macedonia. During a severe trial brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. Just think about that statement. Out of an abundance of joy and their extreme poverty overflowed a wealth of generosity. Their generosity didn't come from a surplus. He doesn't say, hey, God bless them. They had way more money than they needed and they sent all the extra. He goes, they had like nothing, and yet they still overflowed with generosity for the people that were in need, right? This wasn't the Macedonian churches giving their fair share. This was them being generous, like God is generous. The generosity was motivated by what? Their abundant joy, despite the poverty that they lived in. And as we've already talked about in the last 2 lessons, that kind of joy comes from valuing what you have. It comes from wanting what you've got, not getting what you want. And this is evident in the life of the Macedonian churches, right? And so the Macedonians understood the value of what they had, and they were grateful. And from that gratitude came a joy that gave birth to generosity, right? And so generosity, this is what I want to talk about today. Generosity is the natural result of gratitude, right? Because gratitude changes your focus. And you're not concerned with what others are receiving when you're content with what you have, right? And so it shifts your focus away from fairness, and it opens a doorway to generosity. Because when you really understand the value of what you have, you're not nearly as concerned with what other people have, right? Gratitude changes your evaluation of things. When you are truly grateful, things come to hold a value that can't be quantified, right? And so this teaches you to think beyond things like payments and exchange rates and fairness, right? And so because gratitude changes the way that you value things, it helps you see that like this whole idea of fair exchange isn't even a reality, because some things are so valuable they can only be given, they can never be paid for. Does that make sense? And so the joy that comes from true gratitude is actually what ignites this generosity, right? When you realize the value of what you have received, when you understand how great a thing the blessings in your life really are, and you feel this joy, this deep well of joy that you draw from daily, it ignites this generosity, this heart, this desire that says, I want to see other people be blessed. I want to see them have these wells of joy and gratitude in their lives, right? When you realize the value of what you have, you want others to have it too. Often, if we're not generous, if we're really focused on fairness and we want to make sure that everybody's doing right by us all the time and that we're not giving up more than we're receiving. So if we're not generous, the real issue is that we're not grateful. The reason we're not generous is because we don't understand the value of what we have received. And it really is that simple. So we've got to challenge ourselves here, right? If we're not generous people, we're probably not grateful people, and that's the issue. So we got to go back to square one. Be content. Be grateful. Live in the joy of gratitude. And generosity will flow. It will flow from us, right? And one of the reasons why generosity is so important and such a beautiful, beautiful thing that is worth pursuing, that is worth doing the hard work to cultivate in our lives, is because generosity is actually what builds community. And I'll explain here. It's what I call like the gratitude generosity loop. And if we read on in 2 Corinthians into the next chapter, in chapter 9, we'll see Paul go in to explain this in verse 11. It says, you will be enriched in every way for all generosity, which produces thanksgiving to God through us. For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but it is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Because of the proof provided by this ministry, they will glorify God for your obedient confession of the gospel of Christ and for your generosity in sharing with them and with everyone. And as they pray on your behalf, they will have deep affection for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. I mean, think about how in verse 13 here, Paul says that the act of generosity is the proof of our obedient confession to the gospel of Christ. That's a powerful concept to think about, right? In other words, one of the ways that you know somebody is truly Christian, truly following Christ and submitting their life to Him, is that their life overflows in generosity. And so he says, they will know how genuine your faith and your obedience to Christ is when they receive the provisions that you're going to send them and bless them with, right? And so when we practice gratitude and generosity, we are blessed, others are blessed. And look what Paul is saying here. Even God is blessed when we practice generosity. Because as we give to other people, the gratitude grows in their hearts. They give thanks to God. And their love for us grows and our love for them grows, right? It's this gratitude, generosity loop, right? When we are grateful, we become generous. And then that generosity provides for others, which then fosters more gratitude in them, which then produces generosity in them and return back to us, and so on, right? And so generosity and gratitude kind of form this loop which builds and binds a strong community. And so gratitude and generosity foster a community that encourages us to care for and depend on one another. Whereas the desire for satisfaction and happiness and fairness drives us apart. It breaks relationships. It erodes community. And so hopefully this is enough motivation for us to do whatever we must do, to learn to be content in every circumstance so that gratitude can grow and joy can flourish and generosity can flow out from us to one another and back to us from one another, and create this loop that binds us in a close, supportive, interdependent, loving community, which is God's design for His people. So I hope that encourages you and motivates you to do those things today. Let me give you some questions just to think about and discuss. If you're in a group setting, that'd be a great time to pause the recording and discuss these questions. If you're by yourself, I would just say, write these questions down, journal, pray, kind of answer them on your own. But here's the question, same as every week, but just some practical framework here for us to work through what we're learning. First, what grabbed your attention in today's lesson? Okay, just what popped out, what concept or idea or nugget really jumped out at you? How does that apply in your life? That's the second question. How does that apply in your life? What does that actually mean, right? For you, and where does that apply? And then how are you going to apply it this week, right? What's something you can take away, that's the third question, today, and apply in your life this week? Because again, we don't just want to be people who hear the Word of God and who intellectually agree with what God is saying, but we actually want to prove that we agree with what God is saying by doing it, right? And that's the real evidence of belief and understanding. So I encourage you to do that. And then when this recording is over, take some time and pray. Ask the Lord to give us a generous heart like His and to give us the opportunity to bless others. Okay? Let's take some time. Let's pray that way today. Lord, you are more generous than anyone. Give us that same heart of generosity for one another so that we can be a blessing to one another, and give us opportunities to bless other people with generosity out of the abundance of the rich things that you have given us. That's what we want to pray today. So hope this lesson has been helpful, and really this series has been helpful in thinking more deeply about gratitude, where it comes from, what it really is, and what it produces in our life. And as we're in this season of Thanksgiving, let's not just make it another holiday, but let's really think about the power of having an attitude of gratitude in our life, and what that does, and how that blesses, and how that builds community around us. And so I hope this has been helpful for you, and just pray that God would bless you today. And have a great day.